everybody. Welcome to episode 207 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris.
And we're going to start off straight away with a reminder about our upcoming read-along.
Yes, our second quarter read-along is a novel by Nora Roberts.
It's called The Awakening, and it's the first book in the Dragonheart Legacy, which is currently a trilogy. We have heard from some readers/listeners that they're really enjoying it, both people who are reading it in print and are listening via audio. So we're excited to hear about those reports. Thank you, everybody. And this book is going to be discussed via Zoom on June 3rd, which is a Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you're interested in joining us, email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. And if you're on Goodreads, we also have a Goodreads thread that's online. You can talk about it there anytime.
And reminder that our read-along conversations are always free and open to everyone. We also had a fabulous email from a listener, Mary from Pasadena. She went on a trip to Texas to see the eclipse. And, of course, incorporated some Biblio adventure in her trip. And let's just read this email. One of my favorite activities of the trip was a visit to the amazing library in downtown Austen. The modern architecture of the building is beautiful, bright, and well laid out for browsing books, reading, or even group meetings. There's a gift shop with a fun selection of book-related items, and there's a coffee bar. Best of all, there's a short story dispensary. And she sent us a picture about it, which we've put in our newsletter. We'll also post it on social media. So this dispensary, you choose the length of the story you'd like, and it spits it out. She also says, couldn't help taking a picture of their book carts, which I'm convinced every book lover needs in their home.
Yeah, it was a really cool modern type of library cart. It would be so fun to have one of those on wheels.
Totally.
Can fill up with your TBR
Yes.
or, whatnot.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary, so much. I mean, when I saw that short story dispenser thing, I was like, not that I don't want to go to my library every day anyway, but I would really want to go if I knew I could
hit a story, right? Yeah, and it dispenses stories that are 1, 3, or 5 minutes long.
So cool.
Isn't that neat? I love that. It's like, I want to know who chooses the stories and how do you get that job?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. If you go on a Biblio adventure, we would love to hear from you. Bonus points for sending pictures.
Totally.
One of the pictures that Mary sent us of this short story dispenser in our monthly newsletter, which we send out monthly. And if you are not a subscriber, we encourage you to do so, which you can do at bookcougars.com. That link is always in the show notes.
Yes.
So.
And that's free as well, our newsletter. I know the word subscribe is tricky these days.
Yes.
But yeah, newsletter's free.
Can be a little loaded.
Yes.
So, Chris, what are you currently reading?
Well, I'm still plugging away on Moby Dick. I'm doing a slowish read intentionally with a group of friends. And I am in the 70s and 80s chapter number-wise right now. And boy, those are some of the brutal chapters about killing whales. And, I do not like to read books where animals are harmed. And I know that these whales are being killed for a purpose back then, but it's still hard. So I'm going to hopefully get through them very soon.
Yeah. And you're forcing yourself to do it a second time. I give you a lot of credit.
Yeah. I think I blocked out those things about the novel from the first time reading it.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm listening to James by Percival Everett on audio. Thank you to Libro FM, where I received an advanced listener copy. But I'm not going to talk about it because I know that you just read it. So you'll talk about it in our next segment. But I just want to thank you because it was your rave review on Goodreads that made me think, okay, get to this one now, Emily. Move it up the TBR.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, a great listen. I listened to it. And I've heard from friends who've read the print book and they've loved it just as much. Yeah. Well, the other book I'm reading, and now, if I choose to, I can take my time with this as well. It's a library book that I had checked out, A Chance Meeting, Intertwined Lives of American Writers and Artists, 1854 to 1967, by Rachel Cohn. I checked it out of the library, and then my friend, the author Janice Herbert, sent me a copy of the newly released NYRB edition of A Chance Meeting, which is wonderful. It just came out in March. She actually sent me the ARC that she had. Janice is an author, and she's also a bookseller. And I pointed out when I talked about this book the last time that they had on the end papers this really cool mind map, or a networking map, right, of all the artists and writers and how they're connected. It's a paperback, right? So it doesn't have end papers in that classic hardcover way, but it does include that map in here, which I was really happy to see because I love that kind of visual.
Yeah, and it's nice because the library copy, the way that the flap worked, it covered it a little bit, but on the paperback, you get the full view. That's lovely.
Yeah, so it's really cool that this book, and again, I don't remember how it first came on my radar, but I obviously put a request into the library right away, and now Janice sent me this. Thank you so much, Janice. I'm going to really enjoy this. It's on my nightside table every evening.
It's so funny, too, because our librarian, Linda, and I had emails back and forth because I think the copy that I linked to in the show notes last time was that new paperback, but the title changed slightly. And so Linda was asking me which one I wanted us to link to because on Goodreads, it was different than on Bookshop.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't notice that the subtitle changed. So the subtitle is still A Chance Meeting, but on the new New York Review of Books edition, the subtitle is Encounters Between American Writers and Artists, as opposed to the intertwined lives of...
Yes. So, Linda, you're going to get your way now. I'm going to go back to episode 206 show notes and put the other version. And then on 207 show notes, we'll have this new one.
Yeah. And if you're interested, if you're going to be doing Sue's Big Book Summer, this new edition clocks in at exactly 400 pages.
Right on.
Although, this is so weird. The back of it says 400 pages, but the actual physical book, it's only 365.
Does it not have the notes because it's the ARC?
Oh, that could be, right? I am looking at the ARC, so Take what I say with a grain of salt. ARCs, advanced reader copies, you're not supposed to quote from them or anything until you see the final copy because so much can change and information is added. So thank you, Emily.
So she didn't just quote from it saying it's 364 pages. Just kidding.
I'm trying to think of something funny to say, like, that is not the quote you're looking for, but it doesn't really work, does it?
Well, I'm also reading the Phoenicia Diner Cookbook, which has an incredible cover. When I was reading the editor, actually, this is funny. Sometimes listeners ask us, how do you find your books? Well, sometimes it's because you're reading a book and you look at the other books the author has written and you say, I must get my hands on that. That's what happened to me. Sarah Franklin, in the author profile, said that she edited the Phoenicia Diner Cookbook. So I quickly scurried to the library and got myself a copy because when I was a kid in the early 80s, I spent summers with Aunt Ellen in Kingston, New York, which meant a lot of time in the back of a little tiny Volkswagen Beetle that had no air conditioning stuck in the Holland Tunnel on the way to upstate New York. And we would, I think, stop at the Phoenicia Diner. If we didn't, I know we passed it because you definitely passed this on Route 28 on the way to Kingston. And I just got it out of the library this morning. It is from the people who currently own the diner. The transition in ownership occurred right around 2011. And Phoenicia in that area had suffered a loss from Hurricane Irene. Do you remember when that came through? When Mike Cioffi took over the diner, it was struggling a little bit, and the owner was in his 80s. So anyway, the beginning that I read is about him pulling up and deciding, he and his family, that they were going to try to open a diner. And it's a cookbook all about the food that they serve now, which is a little bit more highbrow, but still has that diner feel. Just flipping through it, I think the recipe I'm going to try is lemon meringue pie.
Yum.
When I go to a diner, what I always think about is those pies that you see, pies and cakes. And the gentleman caller is a big fan of lemon meringue pie. I've never made one.
Oh, okay. Oh,
yeah.
Good.
So
nice.
I'm super excited. I'll report back.
So Emily mentioned that the cover is really cool, beautiful. I forget the word that you use, but it's really neat because it has one of those boards with the... How do you describe that? I'm sure there's a name for these types of things, but it's where you put the letters in, the letters that you stick between the lines on these signs. And then it has what looks like little stick pins of like a salmon, a coffee mug, and a skillet.
Yeah, it's a skillet that says the Phoenicia Diner and has bacon and eggs. When I was reading it, they said they go through 200 to 300 pounds of bacon a week.
Wow.
Yeah. And that idea of the cover, Chris, translates through the book where each section, like here's the section with soups, salads, and sandwiches, and they do the same thing.
Neat.
Yeah. It's a beautifully, beautifully put together book with nice photos, etc. So Sarah Franklin was one of the editors on this cookbook, which is how I figured this out.
Very cool.
So, Chris, what did you just read?
Well, I finished Bless Your Heart by Lindy Ryan. I just wanted to follow up and say in the last episode, I had mentioned that there is a dog in Bless Your Heart that is injured, taken, and I just wanted to let everybody know that the dog does go through some stuff, but the dog has a happy ending.
That's really nice to know.
Yeah, very nice to know. I was happy about that. This is the one that was our Patreon giveaway this last month, and I described the cover before. It has, I called it a picture. I think it's an illustration of a woman with a red shirt, white pearls, red sunglasses, dark hair, wonderful red lips, and then 2 fangs poking out of these lips. And I thought it was a vampire novel. Not. They're more like zombie creatures. They're called ghouls. I still read it. I still enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I think the cover is completely misleading, and I don't appreciate that.
Especially for a vampire lover.
I know. And the southernness, these are not like Southern Bells in the traditional Southern Belle mode. They're more like Steel Magnolia Southern Bells, if you're going to make a comparison, right? But I enjoyed it enough to finish it. And if there's going to be any more in this series, I don't know if this is going to be a series, come to think of it, or if this is a standalone. I would read more. I mean, I enjoyed the characters enough. I'm curious to see how they'd be developed more.
I think it is a series. I think that's the intention.
I should say thank you to Minotaur Books for sending us the advanced reader copy of this. Yeah, a new cozy horror series. Yeah, it just came out April 9th. That's curious, calling it a cozy horror. What does cozy horror mean? Because people got ripped apart and there's lots of blood. So a cozy mystery versus a cozy romance versus a cozy horror. Kind of interesting to define those things and like what are the levels of violence or sex or people getting eaten and ripped apart.
This sounds like a question for our mystery man. Maybe the next time we have him on, we should ask him this question. All
right, John Valeri, if you're listening, start thinking because we're going to put it to you.
Yes, we are. We're going to put it to you.
Again, that was Bless Your Heart by Lindy Ryan.
Well, this is a perfect segue for me to talk about my short story reads for the last 2 weeks. I finally did what I set out to do with this assignment, which was pull a short story collection off of the bookshelf in my house. And the one I pulled off is called Vampires in the Lemon Grove and Other Stories by Karen Russell.
Oh my gosh, I've always wondered about that. I'm so happy that you're digging into it.
Yeah, she's the author of Swamplandia, which I knew people who read that. I think it was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and she was really young, I think, when that happened. This collection came out in 2013 or so, and I don't know how I got to have it on my bookshelf, but I decided to go ahead and read the title story, Vampires in the Lemon Grove, and it's about an older vampire. He's sitting in a lemon grove in Italy, and he talks about his life and his wife and why he loves the flavor of lemon compared to maybe the other flavors that vampires enjoy. Her writing is kind of odd in a fun way. If you're a fan of George Saunders, Stephen King, people who write unusually, I think you'll like at least the first story in the collection so far I can speak to. So that was one of mine. The other short story I read was The Bookkeeper by Willa Cather.
Oh, wow. You read it.
I did.
Yay.
That was the most recent short story in the Willa Cather Short Story Project.
Yes. Yeah. What'd you think?
And then what Chris does is she introduces the short story in a blog post, and then she has a reflection post. And I read the reflection post, and I disagreed with some of the things you said.
Oh, fantastic. Tell me.
Well, folks should know that I'm a bookkeeper by trade, and I have done bookkeeping for years. So just a brief synopsis of what this story is about. It is about a bookkeeper who's keeping the books and is also pursuing a woman that he wants to marry. And he ends up borrowing from his employer some money, $700, I believe.
And this is like 1915,
yeah,
1917.
a lot of money.
Yeah, so yeah.
In bookkeeper parlance, borrowing from your employer is stealing. And it really made me think back to in the early 2000s, I was a business manager at a fine dining establishment. And the insurance guy came in one day to talk about renewing our policy and said to the boss, I think you should take a rider out on Emily. And I was in the room for this conversation. And I looked at him like, what? And he said, well, you know, most bookkeepers, if they're going to steal, they just write checks to themselves.
Wow.
And this policy is a policy that protects the owner if it is uncovered that the bookkeeper has been stealing from the employer.
Damn.
I was horrified.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've always said the reason that I've been successful in my career is because I don't steal from people. But, you know, what this short story made me think of that experience, but also that I think when bookkeepers do steal, not that I would know from experience, but they think they are going to borrow some money and they think they'll just pay it back. And then, you know, they might borrow a little bit more. I mean, there are people I think who just steal because they want to buy more toys and they spend it that way. But a lot of people are just in a tough spot and they think, I'll just borrow it and then I'll pay it back and no one will ever know.
Right.
And so that's kind of what happens in this story, right? He borrows the money so that he can marry this woman, and then their relationship doesn't go very well. He can't pay the money back.
Right. Because, you know, he's entering that new phase of his life when he's married, and you can't anticipate your expenses all that well when you're entering a new phase of your life. And he's lied to this woman from the get-go. So she assumes that he makes X amount of money, and he doesn't. Right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a relationship that was founded on
Deceit.
Lies and deceit. Yeah. And that part I agree with. The part that in your reflection, you talk about how he only paid attention to his work and didn't really pay attention to his wife. I'm not sure how much, you know, I could be accused of that, I suppose. So maybe it touched a chord. But I also feel like, you know, he was in trouble and he was working to try to pay his work back or his money back. I can also say as a bookkeeper, you can tell this touched a little chord, like your work never ends. It's one of those jobs, like if you go on vacation for 2 weeks, there's nobody doing your work. You come back and all that work has just piled up. Some people go to work at a job that if they go away, it happens without them and they come back and they just step right in. So I think that there's a tendency in the field of bookkeeping to like just keep at it or else you'll just be behind and buried in paperwork. So I had a soft spot in my heart for him around that, I think. I also think that the person who was the other person who she was thinking of marrying or who wanted to take her hand ended up being kind of a deceitful person in his own way.
Oh, yeah. He sounds just like a real schmuck.
Yeah.
You know, like a womanizing, deceitful, dishonest man. Right. But
she kind of has an idea that she's going to go for him when this other marriage is falling apart. So she doesn't seem like the perfect person either.
Oh, she is no innocent wallflower by any means, I don't think. And, you know, Cather has a lot of threads in her stories about people who want things that they're not a good fit for, or there's no way they can get it. And they do things from embezzling money to committing suicide. Yeah. You know, you think of like Paul's case is one of her famous stories that gets anthologized a lot about a young man who craves a certain thing and can't get it and knows he never will.
But it was exciting to read one of your short stories and then follow along with you on your response. Made me think about it more deeply.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for reading it and for reading my blog posts. I just really do respond to them and just whatever's on my mind.
Yeah. Well, I highly encourage you to follow Chris's blog, and I will put a link in the show notes to her response to this short story. And if you are interested in reading it, it's available online for free. So you could read the story and then read her response and listen to our conversation about it on episode 207.
Yes. And then pipe in with your response.
We would love to know.
Especially if you're a bookkeeper. The other book that I read was Digital Minimalism Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World by Cal Newport. Cal Newport is one of those productivity guru guys. He's had multiple New York Times best-selling books. I believe he's a New York Times best-selling author. And he has a YouTube channel where he talks a lot about his philosophies and takes email in questions. So he has a lot of like what he calls case studies, you know, talking about somebody's questions. You know, I did binge a bunch of his videos while Laura was out of town last week, and some of the questions are really great about like, well, how do I do this? Full disclosure, I'm the type of person, as Emily knows, I delete apps all the time from my phone thinking like, I shouldn't be looking at this that much. So I delete the apps and then I'm like, oh God, I don't have to deal with that. 2 days later, I put them all back on my phone. And I'm sure every time I tell Emily this, she's internally rolling her eyes, although she looks supportive. So I just went through that again, too, taking all the apps off my phone, all the social media apps, right? Oh, they're all back on. I'm just like, who am I kidding? Like, it's part of my job to be keeping up with social media and my emails, my personal email, my work emails, you know, so it's like, I'm just so impressionable.
Well, it's about figuring out how to manage our time. You know, It's hard. And I know that temptation is great. So
yeah,
I can connotate it to when I go to a bookstore sometimes. You know, we love to go on Biblio adventures and we go to bookstores, but sometimes I'm in the middle of a bookstore or a library and I'm like, why don't you just go home and read one of your books?
Right.
You know?
Yep.
So I can imagine that sometimes you might be in the middle of one of these videos and be like, you know, why don't I just get something done instead?
Dude, you have no idea the hamster wheel that has been in my mind, you know, and that is exactly what happened. I'm like, oh my God, no more of these books, no more of these videos, just do your damn work, you know, like, because I get carried away because I do think it's interesting to see other people's systems.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't mean to be disparaging to Cal, but, you know, maybe he's dispensing advice while someone is in the back taking care of his work or bringing him a ham sandwich. I don't know. Well, I have no idea.
He does have an assistant. They do have a nanny.
Yeah.
He's a full professor who sounds like he works pretty much like 9 to 5. Mm-hmm. He only structures his work day, not his after work time. Mm-hmm. That is a good message to hear, that you do need leisure time. Yeah. I mean, that's one of his whole points. Structuring your work to get the work done that you want, that's going to advance your career or your life goals, whatever it may be. But then really also having time for family and friends and leisure, which are so important to your creativity and your soul and all that good stuff.
The main character, whose name I can't recall in The Bookkeeper,
Percy, I think it was.
Yeah, he would have done well to live by some of that advice.
Yes.
as will both of us. But I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, I really don't mean to be disparaging to him at all, but I do think if you can find systems that work for you, it's great. But I think there's also times when you're reading these things where you have to then put it against the reality of your own life and the kind of work that you're doing. I have read so many things that say, only check your email twice a day. I mean, that doesn't work for me in my particular career because I'm getting emails all day about work that I need to do.
Right.
And some of it can be urgent. So I understand the concept of you probably would be more efficient if you didn't jump to your email when you hear it go off. But on the other hand, you could also get in trouble if you don't do the work that's being sent to you via email.
Exactly, right? It's so much of this is work specific, like what kind of work you do.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because like as a reference librarian, I have to monitor the email because we get questions coming in via email and chat and on the phone. And then of course in real life. So anyway, thanks, Cal Newport. You gave me some good pointers in digital minimalism.
I finished How to Read a Book, which is publishing the day that this episode drops, May 7th. It is also our Patreon giveaway for May. So if you are currently a Patreon, you are automatically entered to win.
Yay!
And we will choose the winner on May 15th. If you are not a Patreon, you have plenty of time to become one. And the links are in the show notes. I really enjoyed this novel. It's told from 3 different points of view. One from a woman who's in prison, one from a woman who goes to the prison to run a book club, and then the third is the husband of the woman who is killed accidentally in a drunk driving accident, and that woman is the woman who's in jail. I don't know if y'all followed that. It's told from 3 different points of view. Wonderful writing, fantastic dialogue. I really enjoyed that part of the novel. Highly recommend if you're looking for a good read.
Good. Yeah. And it's not a romance.
Actually, that is interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. It does have a happily ever after. So I was looking at my bingo card, trying to figure out where it might go.
Oh.
I actually think it could go for the square called Later in Life.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. And I know a lot of people read her other book, 1 in a Million Boy, and really enjoyed it. So that is going to be one that I put on my TBR because I enjoyed her writing so much.
I've heard of 1 in a Million Boy.
Yeah.
The other book that I read was James by Percival Everett. Oh, I love this book so much. Easy 5 stars. I listened to the audio version. I have to say thank you to Libro FM and Penguin Random House Audio for the advanced listener copy. It's narrated by Dominic Hoffman, who delivers just an outstanding performance. I mean, his pacing I thought was impeccable, and his character voices were all excellent. But James, the story itself is just fascinating. It's a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn from Jim, the enslaved man's point of view. It's been a long time since I read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I could still, though, see shades of like, okay, I remember that happening and this happening. Other things, I have ideas of what he being Percival Everett created for this story. But it's amazing to me. Throughout the whole book, he seems to stay loyal to the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and also to American history and what we know about what life was like for enslaved people then, and different working conditions and ways of traveling and communicating. Amazing. I can't say enough good things about this. And I also know that we'll be talking about it on a future episode when you finish it. So more to come.
Yes. Thank you for letting us know via Goodreads that you enjoyed it, because right away I was like, okay, I've heard so many people talking about this.
Yes.
I'm going to start listening. And it's a short listen too. It's just, I think it's like 7 hours. Or
yeah,
like
it wasn't very long. And it's so moving in parts and hard too. Like there are some tough things, but very moving and surprising. Yeah.
I'm not sure I've read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I have scenes that I feel like are in my mind, but then I was thinking, is that because there was a movie at some point that I watched?
Could be. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just part of the American consciousness too, that story. And I mean, one of the issues I have with maybe not a lot of Mark Twain's work, but I just don't think it's all that humorous. You know, he's known as a humor writer, and people talk about, you know, how funny Huckleberry Finn is in parts, and I never saw the humor in any of that.
So interesting.
You know, never in these different characters. And I can understand why some people would think it was humorous, but it never reads to me that way.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I should also add, too, another book that a couple friends have recommended to me now since reading James is called It's Finn by John Clinch. And this is a book from 2007 where it's another retelling of the Huckleberry Finn story from Finn's father's perspective. And one of my friends mentioned that it is taught in American Lit classes. It's been on some syllabi, so I might explore that this summer.
Yeah, and now there's, you know, you could read all 3, which would be so interesting.
Yeah, and now I wonder if there's one from like a woman's perspective. From one of the, there's not very many women in this story. They're peripheral characters, I would say, but that could even be more interesting for them to tell the story that they see.
You could not read Finn and write that instead. I finished Pride and Preston Lynn by Christina Huang Dudley. This is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, or an adaptation, or an inspired by, depends on how you want to look at it. You know, one thing that we're all trying to figure out as we're reading our romance novels also, not just with tropes, but is how much sex we like to have in a novel. And I know that came up when we were talking about our read-along book, Indigo. that some people felt uncomfortable with the amount of sex. Some people really enjoyed it. Pride and Preston Lynn has no sex in it. So if that's something that is or isn't appealing to you, I just wanted to let people know that. I think there's like one hug.
Good to know.
Yeah. I have never read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I have seen several of the film adaptations. At first I was like, oh, this is drudgery. I am not enjoying this. And it had nothing to do with her writing. I really enjoyed the writing. It was a page turner in that way, like very easy. It's contemporary. It takes place in a Chinese restaurant owned by the aunt and uncle of these 3 young women who were orphaned when their parents had a car accident. 2 of the women are college aged, and then their younger sister is still in, I think, high school. The opening scene is that one of the sisters is more attractive and the aunt is trying to, marry her off. So anytime someone that seems like might be a good match enters the restaurant, they get seated in her section of the restaurant. And then Lissy, who is the other sister, who is not a wild child, but, she's studying English, whereas her sister is studying to be a doctor. She's just a little bit more open to the world, I guess, in a different way. And apparently not as attractive. Her aunt doesn't want her to be, to get those tables. Well, she gets sat this table with a handsome man and his family celebrating something, and accidentally, even though they tell her that there's a food allergy at the table, has a meal delivered that has fish in it, and an allergic reaction happens. And that kind of sets off the story, which was a perfect page turner for me. I mean, I loved that. So I want to say very clearly, I enjoyed the book a lot and recommend it. But I think the part, as we're looking at romance novels and trying to figure out what we enjoy, the part that I don't like about the enemies to lovers trope is all the drama. And I think that's what I think of as Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, too, is like, people misunderstanding what people say and misunderstanding who they are and thinking that they're this way and they're that way. I think that gets tiresome for me. It's like, just say it, or ask. And it made me think of our conversation with Yulene, because I was thinking that How to End a Love Story was enemies to lovers. But then when she was talking about it, she said she thinks of it more as a we mustn't, which is a very clear difference. And there was less drama in her book. I feel like there was misunderstanding, but it wasn't quite as drama rich as I feel like these enemies to lovers can be.
Yeah. I guess you can call that, there's drama, but it's a little bit more subdued than a contemporary romance would play that out, possibly. The thing is, too, and this is an impossible thing to do, for Pride and Prejudice to be the book that established that trope, to read that book for the first time, never having been aware that trope is being created then.
Yeah.
What would it be like to read that? It probably wouldn't feel dramatic if you're just being introduced to it. But I think that's the thing, like when you read a lot of the same things, it does start getting like, oh, okay. All right, okay, they do this, do they that? Okay, okay, yeah, now they're together and I'm bored.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing with Happily Ever After. Like, okay, y'all, I know you're going to get together, so let's get to it here.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is something that several of our listeners have said, is that that's one reason they have a hard time getting into romance, is they know things are going to work out. And it's just like a matter of getting there.
Yeah, but then there is also, you feel less stress about it in a certain way. But what I thought that Dudley did really well in this book, being someone who's only, quote, read Jane Austen via film, is taking a contemporary view of it, but putting in some of those things, like the dance scenes, for example, the balls. Like these people are right near Stanford's campus, so there's a costume ball that takes place, and so they end up there dancing, and I was like, oh, that's really a brilliant spin on this. So I really did enjoy it. If you're looking for a fun romance that takes place in a contemporary, and if you are familiar with Pride and Prejudice, I'm sure you would pick up on a lot more of the subtleties of what she was doing to make it an inspired by / adaptation than I did. I caught some of them for sure.
Yeah.
And I should also say that all the characters are Chinese American, which offers a different spin on Pride and Prejudice. So again, it's called Pride in Preston Lynn by Christina Huang Dudley. I just happened upon it at the library and I'm thrilled that I found it.
Very cool.
Oh, the other book that I finished that I'm not going to talk about because we're going to be talking with this author soon is called The Editor, How Publishing Legend Judith Jones Shaped Culture in America. This book is coming out at the end of May. This is the book that I was reading when I discovered that Sarah Franklin edited the Phoenicia Diner Cookbook. So I just thought I'd mention it for that reason, but you will be hearing much more about this book in the future. Chris, did you go on any Biblio adventures?
New sound effects. I did. I had one via the North Haven Library, an online event. The title was A Literary Examination of Power, Love, and Art with Xochitl Gonzalez, author of Olga Dies Dreaming and ANITA de Monte Laughs Last. Such a great event. I'm so happy that I attended. A recording is available to those who registered, I know, and I'll look to see if it's available to the public. So she's a new to me author. And I did start reading ANITA de Monte Laughs Last. I did the preview thing, and I'm definitely going to read the whole book. It's based on the life of actual artists, and I'll say no more at this point. But one of the points I want to make, she's just so vibrant and just friendly and alive, and really enjoyed just listening to her talk. But one of the things that really struck me was she was talking about reactions that people have to her books. A professional critic said that one of the scenes in her book was implausible. And yet, for many of the readers, that's the scene that they talk about a lot, saying that, oh my God, I've had the same experience. I'm so glad you're talking about this. This happened to me too, kind of thing. And it was something that actually happened to her in real life that she fictionalized for this book. And so talking about that, she said her philosophy is there's three types of reactions people have. And so it's you're sympathetic, you've been there, this has happened to you, right? Or you're empathetic, you haven't been there, but you can imagine it, you can feel the pain of what this situation would be like. And then the third is denial. You know, you're completely clueless that other people deal with things like racism or sexism or homophobia or anti-Semitism or anything, right, other than your own worldview. And I thought that is so fantastic, and it's just a shorthand way of thinking about reviews that you read or your own reactions to books. There have been times, and I've been talking with a friend about a book, and they'll say they've had this reaction, and I'll be like, wow, I totally missed that, or it didn't hit me that way. Looking back, it's just kind of like maybe they had that experience and I didn't, so it didn't resonate with me in quite the same way. But now I really want to be on the lookout for my own denial of things when I'm reading or watching, you know. Yeah. So I just really appreciated that. And it's something that's really stuck with me since that event. So again, that was Xochitl Gonzalez, and fabulous event.
Yeah. We'll put a link in the show notes to the video if it's available, and if nothing else, to her novel. And the novel for the win, always, right? I mean, helping people broaden their views, you know, or be called out for not broadening their views in this case. So,
absolutely, right? Yeah.
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 So I attended an event as well at the North Haven Public Library. They have great events there. This was one that my librarian friend Chris told me about. And it was sponsored, I believe, by the American Library Association talk series. But the video is available, so I'll put a link in the show notes. And this was with Paula Johnson, who's the curator in the Division of Work and Industry at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And she was there talking about the book Smithsonian American Table, The Foods, People, and Innovations That Feed Us. I'm going to show Chris the cover. It has this beautiful, vibrant cover with foods from many different cultures. On the back is a bowl of matzo ball soup, which makes me hungry every time I see it. And then some really lovely black and white photos of historical events in history. And this is United States specific. That's why it's called American Table. There's even a picture of one of the original food carts in New York City.
Nice. A little push cart.
Yeah, push cart. What it talks about is how immigration and migration really shaped the food in America. And so they have recipes for each of those representations that they're talking about. She called out some specific people who were known in history too, including Brownie Weiss, James Beard, and Julia Child. And one of the things she talked about is that the exhibits they have at the Smithsonian in this area regarding food, people, and innovation, and Julia Child's kitchen resides there, which really made me think, ooh, Biblio adventure in the future.
Oh, for sure.
So it was a great event. She was really interesting, and I will put a link in the show notes to the video if you would like to listen.
Well, last Saturday was Independent Bookstore Day, and I did go to our local independent bookstore here in Guilford, Connecticut, Breakwater Books. I had pre-ordered a book, a specific edition of A Sun at the Front by Edith Wharton. It's the new Oxford World's Classics edition that has an introduction and notes by Julie Olin Amantorp, who's also a Willa Cather scholar. I got there later in the day, so most of the festivities were over. Like, they didn't have all their stuff out front. I know they had sale stuff out front. I think I saw pictures like that they had a banjo player and, a lot of festivity stuff throughout the day. But even though I got there like an hour before they closed, the place was still packed.
That's great.
Yeah, so that was really nice to hear. And there were 4 teenagers working at that point, and they all looked a little tired. And they said, yeah, we've been really slammed all day. It's been great.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So that was
cool.
It was nice to get there.
Well, I didn't get to a bookstore on Independent Bookstore Day. I was down in New York City visiting Aunt Ellen, but we did go to a bookstore on Sunday, the next day, and we got down to Chinatown to You and Me Books. You and Me Books is the first female-owned Asian American bookstore, cafe, and bar with an inventory focused on diverse voices and highlighting immigrant stories. And they were forced to close back in 2023. In the summer, there was a fire in one of the residential units right above the store, I think. So there was water damage and smoke damage, and they had to close. They did a big GoFundMe campaign in order to be able to pay their employees and keep things going. And they just had a grand reopening in January. So it was really nice to get into the store and see it filled with customers on a beautiful sunny day. It's a really small store, beautifully curated. They focus a lot on Asian authors, but there are authors from all walks of life as well there. They had this really cute room in the back that they called the reading room, super tiny, like a little closet, but they had comfortable chairs there and some books you could pick up and read. And then they also had a shelf with free books there, some fun stickers. There was a basement, which in a building like that was like the sub-basement, and that's where they had their poetry and YA. And again, like couches and a place to just kind of hang out and relax. There was a coffee bar. So even in this tiny little space, they really accomplished a lot. And it would be fun to try to go an event there. I don't know if they actually have them there or if they do them somewhere else, but so excited to finally get there.
Very cool. I remember reading about the fire and the community all coming together to help them get back on their feet. And,
Well, we had 2 joint jaunts. One was in person and one was us both doing something at home alone that we're going to talk about. That sounded a little bit interesting, didn't it? Should we talk about our joint jaunt to R.J. Julia's Booksellers?
Yes, we went there to see Caroline Leavitt talk about her new book that is out and about in the world now.
It's called Days of Wonder. It's a novel. And for those of you who were at Booktopia, you just got to spend the weekend with Caroline, which is so lovely. This is a book about a young woman who fell in love with a man. Things went a little bit awry in their relationship in the sense that they thought about killing the young man's father. That's kind of going awry. We're not going to tell too many of the details except to say that the young woman ends up in prison and she's pregnant and gives the baby up for adoption. And the novel really picks up once she's out of prison. She's back at home with her mother, and she decides that she wants to find her daughter and also kind of like start living her life that had been put on hold for 6 years while she was in prison. And she ends up going to Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Great city.
Yeah, and that's where the novel really takes off. And what Caroline did was tell us some of the backstory for why she wrote the novel.
Right. Yeah, it's based on a friend and how that friend was very young and impressionable when she committed murder, and that during her time in prison, she really was a model prisoner and really wanted to turn her life around. And she did. And she got out of prison and was having a very successful life when somebody found out about her background, and she lost her life again and had to start over.
Right. Change her name, reinvent herself, and move. And this is someone who is a friend of hers. And so she wanted to write a story inspired by her, but obviously also maintain this woman's privacy. So that's what this novel is.
Part of it is that the woman in the story is not as wealthy as her boyfriend. And so the boyfriend pretty much gets away with having no punishment, and she gets put in prison. And it made me think of the movie Heavenly Creatures.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, a very similar situation. Two girls who are passionately in love with one another plot to kill one of the mothers. And the girl who's working class goes to prison, and the girl who is upper class goes away to school and becomes a famous author. Mm-hmm. Right? Just how different our lives are based on our economic circumstances and background. I mean, it was fascinating to hear some of the background of the rural person. And at least in our society, there's very little hope of a second chance for many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I would go one step further to say that our prison systems aren't necessarily designed to help with that either. I mean, people can get education and degrees, and I think this woman did. I think when she was in prison, she pursued a college degree and got one. But we make it really difficult when people get out. And Caroline has the character lie when she gets out because she's applying for a job. And there's that checkbox on the job application. Have you ever been accused or committed a crime or been...
Are you a felon?
Yeah,
I think.
felon,
something like that. Yeah.
And she didn't check it. And that's part of the reason she got the job. A lot of times that's not really something you can get away with because people do background checks, etc. But in this novel, that happened. What Caroline did that night that was really fun was she told a lot of stories. She told stories about her own adventures in being an author and how she became an author and then experiences she's had in her life, and also told a lot of stories about people that she met while researching this book. She's a great storyteller, no surprise. She's a great oral storyteller and written storyteller.
Yes. Yes. Amazing. You know, she talked about that, how she had 8 books published. And I think she even was under contract for another one when they said, we're just going to drop you. We don't like this book. You know, she's like, well, I'll write another one. They're like, no, we think our time together is done. So after publishing so many books, she got dropped. Something happens and that book gets published and it's a bestseller, right? So she wanted to give people hope that if you're writing and you're writing and you're writing, and if you do get published and your peers are getting bestsellers or getting awards or whatever, you know, don't lose hope. Like, keep writing because you just never know.
Yep.
And I thought that was a great message because you do think like, gosh, you know, you've published 8 books.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Yeah.
And then for your publisher to do that, but then your next one is a bestseller. Like, haha.
Yeah. Yeah. And she's someone who had really quick success early. Like, her first novel was a huge success. So she also tells the story where she was like, oh, this is going to be so easy.
Right, yes.
You know, and things happened. So Caroline's also a great citizen in the writing community and was the brains behind A Mighty Blaze,
right,
which is an online group of all volunteers who interview authors and help to sell books and encourage people.
Yeah, she talked about how her book was just coming out, or one of her books was just coming out as the pandemic hit. And her publishing house called and said, sorry, you know, all of the events are going to be canceled. So she's like, oh, geez, what do I do? So she went online and did a YouTube video and then started talking with other writers and interviewing them about their books. And she thought, you know, I'll put the word out and we'll see. It's something like over 200 writers contacted her. And she's like, whoa. And then Ron Charles from the Washington Post contacted her and said, what are you doing? keep doing it,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
so Jenna Blum then reached out to her and said, hey, how can I help? And the rest is history.
Yeah, and we actually have a YouTube conversation between Jenna and Caroline when all of this first started happening, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that. And then also Caroline did talk to us about her last novel as well, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah. And it was wonderful. It was a kind of a smaller event. I think there were a lot of other events in the area that night, and Caroline is on tour, so I know she'll have a variety of different types of events coming up. But the people who were there were all so engaged and curious and already lovers of her novels. Our listener Amy was there, and that was so much fun to meet her in real life. She's a big fan of Caroline's work.
Yes. Hello, Amy.
Yeah. Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for saying hello.
A joint jaunt that we had but didn't jaunt together, we both just sat on our couches in our own homes, was to watch the movie Shirley. And now we should say there's another movie called Shirley that just came out this year that's about Shirley Chisholm.
Oh.
This movie, Shirley, is about Shirley Jackson and came out in 2020 and is loosely based on the novel by Susan Scarf Merrell called Shirley.
Okay. Yes. And so I remember when this movie was first coming out, I heard it called a biopic, which is like a biography movie of somebody's life. And this is not a biopic in any stretch of the imagination. It's a creative work that uses Shirley Jackson as a character and some of her life, like who she's married to, where they live. Those things are accurate, but other things are left out completely, like the fact that she had 4 kids, and she probably wasn't as scary and creepy in real life as she is portrayed in this movie. But the point, I mean, I did have to read reviews after I watched this because I was just like, oh my God. The point being that the movie creates something that Shirley Jackson could have written, right? That creepy kind of women are trapped in this domestic patriarchal hell that just withers them and crushes their spirits and makes them into monsters.
Yeah, essentially it was as if it was telling the story of Shirley Jackson as told via one of her short stories. They put her in one of her short stories.
Right.
Because a lot of her short stories had that sort of theme in them.
Right. Yeah, so the story has a fictional couple, a young straight white couple coming to Bennington, Vermont. The husband's going to be teaching a TA position, and the wife is pregnant early on in their marriage, and she gets kind of entrapped to do all the domestic work. I guess we don't want to give too many spoilers.
Yeah.
Like, it was painful to watch. Like, the first half hour, I was just like, oh, I don't know if I could do this. It was painful to watch and so uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But then it gets fascinating. Yeah. Because you're thinking, what the hell's going on?
Yeah. And Shirley Jackson, at the time, during the movie, is writing a novel. And she's writing, they say, Hangsman, which is one of the novels she does publish. And it does really look at the relationship she has with her husband. And there are things that were true, like her husband was a man who strayed.
He was unfaithful with his college students, where it's just
so there was things like that. So, it touches on that. But there were no children in the movie. I mean, we won't talk too much about that. But in real life, she had 4 children. And that was part of the pain she suffered, was how did she have a career and have time to write when she had a husband who was very focused on himself and very controlling of her and her writing. And she also helped to keep the family afloat financially. Right. So, yeah, I thought it was brilliant. I thought Elizabeth Moss did a fantastic job. Yeah. Holy smokes.
She plays Shirley. It's like, wow. Yeah. I know. She was scary. Yeah. I mean, really scary. She did a brilliant job on that film. I kind of thought about it even later that night in bed when I was trying to sleep. It popped into my head again. I was like, oh my God, like, it's so much about possession and vampirism and just, ugh. Yeah.
I would also say there was a mushroom scene in the movie. We've talked about mushrooms in the past that I was like, no, don't do it. So, yes, it was really good. And we should say thank you because we had a listener who called in to the Cougar hotline. We do have a telephone number.
Yeah, so write this down, everybody, and then give us a call. 860-391-6674. Call us with all of your bookish Biblio adventures that you want to share or questions you want to ask us.
Yes, the listener who called, I think you just said, really enjoyed the Shirley movie. So here we are. Thank you. We really appreciate it. I'm glad I watched it.
I am too. Like, that was one I wanted to watch even before it came out. The buzz was on my radar. And here it is now, like what that came out in 2019. And now it's 2024 and I finally did it. But yeah, so thank you, listener, for that. And thank you to Emily for watching it too, so that we could talk about it. Because it is one that you're going to want to talk about.
100%.
Yeah.
So, Chris, do you have any upcoming jaunts?
I'm going to get to see Aunt Ellen. Yes.
Woo, woo. We are going to New York City. I'm working on an itinerary for us. What we know for sure is that we're going to go to the Ripped Bodice bookstore in Brooklyn, which is a romance bookstore. Super excited about that. That's what we know for now. If anyone has any other ideas of what we should do while we're in Brooklyn, let us know.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that. I mean, just to see Aunt Ellen, like, I don't care what we do, just hanging out is going to be great. But yeah, I look forward to going back to Brooklyn. This will be my second time there. And my first time there was with the two of you as well.
Such a great place. I love going to Brooklyn, and it's spring, so it should be lovely. I'm also hoping to see the movie The Art Thief. And this is not like directly related to a book, I don't think. But it does have a heist that occurred at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. And I'm still making my way through the book Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabel Stewart Gardner by Natalie Dykstra. So it just seems appropriate that I should see that movie that's out in theaters now. So that's on my list.
Very cool. How about upcoming reads?
I have two. Tap Dancing on Everest by Mimi Zeman. And this is a memoir that just came out in April. And it's written by an MD. Mimi is an MD. And she was in her third year of med school when she decided to go on a trip where they were going to attempt a new route on Mount Everest, on the east face of Mount Everest. And she was going along as the doctor. And that's what this memoir recounts. It says, on Everest, when 3 climbers disappeared during their summit attempt, she reached the knife edge of her limits and dug deeply to fight for the climbers' lives and to find her voice. So that one sounds really intriguing.
It really does. I mean, one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, which was about the 96 Everett disasters that really started changing how mountain climbers were allowed to approach the mountain.
Well, that's one of the things that intrigued me about this memoir, because they very specifically do not use guides. The team climbs without using supplemental oxygen, porter support, or chance for rescue. Because I have some of my own feelings about using porters and putting them in harm's way.
Right, yeah. And the thing with Jon Krakauer's book is he talks about how these companies would sign on 12 people to go climb Mount Everest. And sometimes they weren't in physical shape to be able to do that, or mental shape to do that, and just how many people died.
Right. Yeah. So I'm interested to see her take on this. Also on upcoming reads is Pay Dirt by Sarah Paretsky. This is a V.I. Warshawski novel. There's many in the series, but this is the most recent that just came out in April. And I'm looking forward to being introduced to the series. I've never read one. Have you?
I have. I did read a couple of the really early ones because they're set in Chicago. You know, it's fun to read books in places that you know. This one, I think, might be set in Kansas. I mean, the cover has this fantastic red sunset on what looks like an old farm plains homestead.
Yeah.
So more to come on that. I have two as well that I'm looking forward to. The first is 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster by Mirene Lee. This is one of the books on the Woman's Prize shortlist. I did a preview of each of the 16 books. That was a fun exercise. And this was a book where it's like, oh, when the preview ended, I was like, no, I want to know more. So this is the first copy that I got, or the first book that I chose to read the whole thing. And then the other one is one for my bingo card. This is going to be a paranormal romance, Looking for Love in All the Haunted Places. This is by Claire Kahn, Kann, and it is coming out May 21st. It's like a haunted house love story. I'm really looking forward to just relaxing with this one.
Yeah, and there's that word cozy again. So we'll be able to discuss that further. And in the Out Now category, we have Real Americans by Rachel Kong, Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy by Kate West, Daughters of Shandong by Eve Chung, When Cicadas Cry by Carolyn Cleveland, The Stolen Child by Anne Hood, and How to Read by Monica Wood, which is the Patreon giveaway.
Fabulous.
So coming up next is our conversation with Rebecca Romney.
Yes, Rebecca is a rare book dealer, and we talk about a lot of different things in this segment with her, from her own reading to collecting to dealing books. One of the things that we mentioned in our introduction is that Rebecca is the co-founder of the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize, which is something we didn't get into talking with her about. So we just wanted to give it a little bit of a shout out before launching into the conversation with her. This is an award that was created for women collectors who are 30 years of age and younger. So there are not too many requirements for this. The winning collection just must have been started by the contestant, and all items in the collection must be owned by her. And we really encourage you to take a look at the prize website, because as Rebecca sheds light on, collections don't have to be these big monolithic things. Collections are very personal. So check that out. The deadline for this year's award consideration is June 15th. Really fun collections. They list the past winners and show pictures of their collections. Highly recommend you check that out. One of the other things we talk with Rebecca about is the catalog she put together of romance novels in English going back to 1769. And the book that kicks off this fantastic collection is The History of Emily Montagu. It was written by Frances Brooke, again, 1769. And this is the first novel in English written in and about Canada. So for those of you who are into Canadian lit, if you're not aware of this one, it might be one to check out.
And you can actually download what we're talking about as a PDF.
Right.
So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, it's the romance novel in English. And it's wonderful that she made that free. Yeah. You can also get a print copy if you like, but the PDF is completely free.
And her website is fantastic too. So we will put a link to that in the show notes as well. Enjoy our conversation with Rebecca.
Happy reading. We are so excited to talk with rare book expert, author, and proud genre reader, Rebecca Romney. Rebecca's rare book firm is Type Punch Matrix. Such a cool name. And she co-founded the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize. Rebecca's first book was Printer's Error, Irreverent Stories from Book History. And she's written thought-provoking essays, such as Resisting the Monolith, Collecting as Counter-Narrative in Uncanny Magazine, which was about collecting feminist sci-fi. Her catalog, The Romance Novel in English, A Survey in Rare Books, 1769 to 1999, was mentioned multiple times at the Yale Romance Conference we attended last year. The Washington Post called it a pioneering overview. You may have seen Rebecca's book expertise in action on the popular History Channel show Pawn Stars. She was featured in the documentary The Booksellers and has been profiled and interviewed by places like The New York Times, Newsweek, and The Guardian. And we are thrilled to feature her here today. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Rebecca, on our last episode, we had an author, Rebecca Rigo-Berry, and she was talking about the vanishing of Carolyn Wells.
Right.
And we were talking about collecting in general. She said that she always collected things even as a young girl. Were you a collector as a young person?
I was a collector, but in ways that I did not recognize as collecting. It was, instead, people just thought I was weird, to be honest. So I was of the era of trolls. I had over 100 trolls, and each one of them was not only individually named, but then I created an entire little town for them where each had their own roles, and I would move them through the town all through the day. And it was a whole thing, and people thought I was weird. In retrospect, I was collecting, I was categorizing, I was turning it into something new. And that is essentially what collectors do.
That's great.
That is great. Could we just talk a little bit more about that, about what is collecting and who are collectors?
Collecting is essentially the mindful acquisition of material bounded by certain themes and parameters. It does not necessarily take money. It does not necessarily take expertise. It essentially takes curiosity, coming up with your scope, and then just doing it. You just have to jump in and do it. So, in book collections, that can take a lot of different forms. When people think about book collecting, they often think about the big books that make headlines, the sort of Shakespeare folios that sell for millions of dollars. And they say, oh, collectors and rare book institutions, everything is in libraries, or it is just with the really wealthy. And I'm not a collector. I'm not part of that. But in fact, if you think about collecting simply as mindful acquisition within a particular scope, then most of us do that in some form. And that can be as simple and humble as, this is my favorite author, and I really like when this particular cover artist works with this author, so I'm going to get all the books where that cover artist illustrates the books of this author. That's a collection. And you probably created that incidentally, or maybe not even for a lot of money, but none of that matters. You have created a scope, and you have actively sought that material, and you've created your collection.
That's so fascinating. Do you think, this may be kind of an odd question, but do you think part of it is also that people imbue their collections with some sort of emotion attached to it? They want to keep it because it's meaningful in some way.
I do think people collect because they find some meaning in it, but I also think that's why we read. I think that we have this tendency to put our emotions on other things, and we often use things like reading to give ourselves just enough distance from our own emotions that we can kind of look at it and examine it, and examine ourselves through the plots and through the characters or through the books. So for me, these things are all related. Like, yes, I do think that anyone can kind of understand the idea that we imbue these objects with meaning when you think of things like, oh, a wedding band. That is a ring, but it has symbolic meaning. Or say you have a favorite like blanket or stuffed animal from childhood. That is probably like mine, like a raggedy old stuffed animal, but it has deep meaning to me. That is a different type of value than, say, the value it might get, on a marketplace. This is something I talk about a lot with collecting, is that there's marketplace value. You think about like how much a book costs, how much you have to pay for it. Then there's also things like historical value. Does this book have any meaning to us? There's something for interpretation's sake that we can gather from it. And then there's also sentimental value, which is what this means to me. And in my opinion, those often work together. Like, marketplace value is not superior to sentimental value. Even though people always think that, they're like, oh, what is it worth? And I'm like, I don't care. Do you like it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can really affect the price of things, though, too, because people attach a sentimental value that they may never be able to garner from the price that someone's willing to pay for it.
There is this sense that the marketplace value equation is one of supply and demand, right? So how many copies survive and how much do people want it? And how much do people want it can be related to the sentimental value. Like, if there's higher demand, then okay, the prices will go up. But this is actually where you can be kind of clever in your collecting, say if you don't have a lot of disposable income. Essentially, you have a topic that you really like, and all of the big books in that topic are hard to find. Like, a Jane Austen first edition is very, very expensive. And you're like, I can't get a Jane Austen first edition. Well, you have to go to the paths where there's less demand. Maybe you start collecting the Austen publications that came out as cheap reprints throughout the 19th century, or you look for all of the Austen covers that feature a particular like leitmotif, like every one that has a woman reading on the cover. And that in and of itself is a collection that you are able to create because you're moving away from where everyone else's demand is, and you're focusing on something that you find interesting. So what you bring to something, I think, is a really key part of how we think about collecting and what its value is.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that is. It's like telling the story of your collection, whatever that may be, is just so important, and just the importance of stories. And that kind of leads me to thinking about romance as a genre, and how, you know, you put together this fantastic collection and wrote the catalog of it, and just how disposable romance and genre fiction has been. So can you talk a little bit about that whole process of putting together that collection and perhaps your own philosophy of collecting?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about collecting romance, especially collecting romance after the founding of Harlequin, which was 1949, this is the post-war paperback boom. Those types of romances were created intentionally as disposable products. You read them and you throw them away. And when you think about category romances, the ones that are coming out sort of on a monthly basis to be sort of replaced in the next 6 weeks, that type of thing, that are on magazine racks. They're in racks in different in pharmacies and grocery stores. Those were meant to be treated like magazines and other ephemeral publications. You read it, you throw it away. You read it, you move on. And that means that while it seems like there are many, many romances, vintage romances, all along secondhand bookstores, that large amount of material belies the fact that individual titles are actually very scarce. So one thing that I find fascinating is that if I were to go online right now and search for first edition copies of Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, there would be quite a few of them. And then I might look online for a first edition copy of a famous category romance, like, I don't know, the first Harlequin Presents. And to find the first printing of that, there are going to be fewer of those online than the Hemingway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it seems like they're everywhere, but they really aren't. And that is one of the reasons that it was so tricky to put together the collection. It took many years for me to do it, partially because I had to sort of adapt and play around, and I was fighting against these limitations in the marketplace. One of the other limitations that's really tricky is if you're caring about things like first editions. I was looking for the sort of first printings of these books, many of which were technically paperback reprints of hardcovers, but then they start becoming paperback originals. So I'm looking for the firsts. In looking for these firsts, the marketplace online right now is secondhand for romance books, meaning like they're not paying attention to things like first edition. And so when they're describing the book that they have for sale, they rarely say first edition or first printing. And so you go online and you're looking for like a copy of The Flame and the Flower, and there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of copies, and none of them are distinguished from each other. And you're like, how do I find the first printing amid all of this? Because no one cares enough to distinguish what printing it is. So I found that things that I thought might be easy to find because they were so important, because they were so impactful, they actually still were really hard to find because of the practicalities of how the marketplace works right now. So those are some sort of surprises that I found as I was building this collection. In terms of my philosophy for it, there were two things I was looking to accomplish with the romance collection. The first was to not create something that was comprehensive, but that was at least somewhat representative of the main trends in the history of the romance novel in English. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to sell the collection to an institution. The idea there being that when we write our histories, when we say this is what the past was like, the people who do that are doing work on primary sources in special collections libraries. That's where they're getting their material. And so if the material is not there for them to study, then it doesn't make it into their histories. And if it doesn't make it into their histories, then the people reading their histories don't even ever know it existed. And that is what is accomplished when you actually get this material in special collections, is you're making it accessible in a way that people can build on what you have built and keep going. So I wanted to sell it to an institution, and I wanted to sell it to an institution where it would be used not only for research, but also for students, so that people could have access to it and look at it and see, oh, there is really a there when it comes to collecting the history of romance.
That's really fascinating and so important. I really love archives, and I've heard scholars say things like, oh, well, the archive didn't have that. And as if they're blaming the archive as opposed to where do archives get their stuff?
Yes.
Putting together such a representative collection to have for people to study and then write about and then get the word out. It's just really brilliant.
I was just going to say, I think that we have this idea that archives and special collections libraries are frozen in time. Like they already have everything that's important. And in fact, that is not only not the case, but also rare book curators, librarians, archivists, they have a lot of things on their plate. They're serving the people who are coming to them right now. They're providing access now for the materials they already have. They don't have a lot of time to look and add to their collections. This is why collectors and dealers are so critical in this ecosystem, is because we're the ones who are often going out and finding the material and making the case for why it's important. And that's usually the point when it ends up in the special collections and the libraries. So in my opinion, this is people all working together because, as we know, institutions are sort of notoriously understaffed and underfunded. So they need help. And I think a lot of people don't realize that you can be the one who helps. You can be the one who intervenes and says, I want to make sure this is preserved, so I'm going to do it myself.
You know, you just hit on it a little bit. Why is romance important? Because a lot of people would say, nobody cares about romance. You know, romance gets a bad rap in that way. So tell us why you think it's important.
I find it fascinating when people dismiss the single genre that has the most readers of any other genre in the history of the novel, at least in English. I don't know about other languages. Literally from the beginnings of the novel in English, starting with Richardson's Pamela. I mean, he's not the beginning, but let's just show him as an example. Going through Frances Burney, who was a huge influence on Jane Austen. Romance novels were the ones that people were reading, were the things that people were talking about, were the things that they were incorporating into their everyday lives as, this is the material that I like. And the idea that because you're making some qualitative judgment, you're going to ignore the reading experiences of millions of people across centuries is just baffling to me.
Yeah, right. The essay that you wrote about collecting feminist science fiction was fascinating, and that dealers who are out there didn't even realize that that is a category. Again, it gets back to your point of people not knowing that something even existed.
Yeah, and I think it's fine not to know that things exist. I think, we're all sort of limited and we're learning and expanding as we go. But what I get stuck on is when they take that one step further and say, well, that means it doesn't matter. Or they just don't show any curiosity. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of books that I don't like and I don't need to like. And that's fine. But to have absolutely zero curiosity to try and to see before I've made that decision, that's what I don't understand. And so a lot of the times that sort of bad rap we talk about with romance, of course, we all know comes from people who don't read romance. Mm-hmm. And that lack of curiosity is what gets me.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, somehow what we're discovering too, as we're focusing on it this year, it seems like people are also threatened by it.
I do think that is part of there's a performance in the lack of curiosity, right? It's a shield, like, oh no. So I do think those are related.
Yeah. Talk about that a little bit more.
Well, I think that the thing about romance is that it has a reputation for being centered around women. And that in and of itself, I think, can be intimidating because of the fact that things we traditionally associate with women often get denigrated. So if you like something that's associated with women, then you are opening yourself up to denigration. And I think that showing, therefore, a big performance of not liking it is your way of guarding yourself against that kind of attack. And I think that it's not just men who do this, by the way. I think a lot of people do this. And I think that it is something that we have to grapple with and that we can never ignore when we're talking about romance. Romance is not, of course, only about women. But given that is its reputation, it is always there underneath the surface.
So, Rebecca, I love how you called the system from readers to archives and everything in between an ecosystem. We're curious about, what is a day or a week of your life like with your business? What is it that a rare book dealer does? I think a lot of people might think that you just sit in your shop and wait for people to come in and occasionally dust the books or something like that.
Yeah, like open a book and blow and all the dust comes off.
Yeah, that stereotype of, I own a bookshop, so I just read all day. Right. Wouldn't that be nice? No. So there are three main things that a rare book dealer does in order to stay in business. The first is buy books, the second is catalog books, and the third is sell books. And that seems very basic, but I'll just kind of walk through some of that because for a rare book dealer, a lot of it's more complicated than you think. Buying is a great example of this. So in the rare book world, I cannot manufacture my product. I have to find it. And what that means is I have to spend a great deal of my week, literally on a daily basis, I am looking for material. Sometimes I have, want lists from collectors. They say, if I can just get this one thing, I will buy it from you. And these can be very expensive books sometimes. I have things on my want list for some collectors that are, 5-figure or 6-figure books that everyone would be happy if I could find them, but I can't find them. So this is what I'm constantly doing as part of my job is I'm just looking, I'm searching, I'm hunting, I'm what we call scouting all the time. I get my books from a big variety of sources because this is so hard. So I do buy a lot from private collectors, people who come to me, they call, they email. I also try to buy at auction, though that is a lot more effort usually for the payoff. And I ideally buy big libraries altogether. So there are a few different ways that I look for and acquire material, and I'm trying to make that as wide-ranging as possible because I'm trying to sort of spread my gaze as widely as possible in order to find the material. So that's a huge part of my day. The next part is cataloging, which is for a rare book dealer, a pretty labor-intensive process too, because we are essentially documenting this book as a historical artifact. We are not just describing its importance to, our history or culture or pitching why someone should buy it. That usually is in there, but that's only one part of a rare book dealer's job. The other part of the rare book dealer's job is to describe the unique characteristics, the physical characteristics of the copy in front of them. This is why I always think it's funny when people talk about stealing rare books. They're black market for rare books, things like that. I think that's very funny because a rare book dealer's job is literally to describe what's unique about that copy. And there are famous court cases where a book has been stolen and they have brought in an expert who had actually cataloged that book and could say, there is, say, a stain on page 58 on that copy. I know because I cataloged it and I noted that stain. And then they were able to say, oh, yes, it does match that documentation. So this is what we do, is we document it as a historical artifact, and that requires a great deal of precision and specificity. Then we are ready to sell it. And when we sell it, there are, of course, a number of different ways we do it. But for me, I focus on selling by relationships because collectors are, not just buying one thing. It's not a one-off. That's not what a collection is. And so oftentimes what I'm doing is I'm working with people over the course of years to help them build their collection. That means that we're establishing relationship. This is truly what made me fall in love with being a rare book dealer, because what it allowed me to do is essentially be a professional enabler. I spend all of my time just saying, have you heard of this book? What about this book? Oh, I love that book too. Tell me more about that book you just acquired. And so I just get to talk books with people all day, and I get to enable and encourage them. And in fact, the more I do that, the more I tend to sell, the better it is for me. So to me, I am just personality-wise someone who really enjoys watching other people get excited. And that is a huge part of what sales is in a rare book side, is I'm just enjoying and enabling someone else's excitement.
Yeah, that's great.
That is totally.
So that could be a good segue to ask you a question about your experience being on Pawn Stars. Do you feel like that was a lot of enabling or a lot of disappointing people, or was your experience different than what we were seeing, on the other side?
Well, I don't know if it was different from what you saw. The thing I find interesting about Pawn Stars is essentially I'm doing what I do every day in my job, just with cameras there, which is to say, oftentimes you only get 30 seconds or a couple minutes to not only say why this book is important, but also justify the price you're going to put on it. So it was very funny when I first started filming there. I was only about a 10-minute drive away from the shop. I came on to the show because I was managing a rare book gallery on the Strip in Las Vegas. And so I would be doing all of my normal things at my job, and then I would drive down, do the same thing where there were cameras, and then I would go back to my work. And on the one hand, in practice, it felt very normal to me, but because it was filmed, it then gets sort of refracted into this larger thing. But I do feel strongly about doing things like that, about participating in popular media like that, because of my own experience with how I got into rare books. You know, like I came into rare books entirely by accident. It had to be by accident because I did not feel welcome or invited in before that. And it's not even that people were rude to me. It was that I made assumptions in advance. I didn't have the curiosity. I stopped and said, oh, that's not for me. Just like judging a book before I had read it. I was like, the rare book world, that cannot possibly be for me. And so then I stumbled upon it accidentally with this job listing for that gallery in Las Vegas. And I applied, and I realized very quickly after starting the job that, oh no, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. This is absolutely my career. I love this. And I would have missed that. I would have missed my calling, essentially, if I had kept that assumption and just gotten comfortable with the idea that that wasn't for me. And so when I'm selling books in a place like Las Vegas, or when I'm going on TV on a show like Pawn Stars, a lot of what I'm doing is I'm trying to look for people like that, people who would love to be part of this world if they only knew it existed and they only knew that they could be part of it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I remember the first time I went into a rare bookstore. I can't remember the name of it, but it was on Printers Row in Chicago, where I'm from. And I walked past that place several times, you know, and I finally walked in because, you know, as a college student, I had like, you know, $10 to my name. I thought I have no business going into a place like this and wasting their time because I couldn't buy something or whatever. But of course, they were super nice and friendly once I got in there, and they were like, you know, if you want to see anything behind the glass, just let us know. I know you can't make generalizations across the board, but most of the rare book people I've dealt with have been super friendly and happy to talk about their goods or questions you have.
I do think that the rare book world is very naturally intimidating because oftentimes you see the big prices. That's very intimidating on its own. And then we're also often talking about these very grand things, like the first book to do X, you know, Newton's Principia Mathematica, the laws of, you know, motion are laid out for the first time. We tend to get very monumental. And when we're thinking about preserving our material histories, we talk in these very grand terms. And what that I think has the side effect of is it makes us feel very small. And on the one hand, that can be healthy. But if you're already intimidated, either because maybe the books seem very expensive or you think, oh, I don't know very much, because I think everyone feels that way when they walk into a bookstore. Wow, I haven't read most of these. You know, there are a number of reasons that you might be intimidated. And then when you're thinking about these sort of grand narratives and these bigger purposes that we're aiming for in rare book collecting, it can make you feel, oh, well, I'm insignificant. But we have so many examples in the history of book collecting where individual collectors created an amazing collection that then did have significance moving forward.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because when we were at the Yale conference, I remember there was a young woman in the front row who stood up and said, you know, I was at my grandma's house and I went down into the back basement and I found this brown paper bag filled with romance novels. And that was her introduction into the romance novel. And she fell in love. But she was kind of curious, like, you know, first of all, do these books have a value? And even if they don't have a value, what's the best way for me to just keep track of them? And I remember you stood up and said, meet me outside and I'll tell you, you know. So if people have a situation like that, how do you recommend they get started?
So if they have a lot of, say, vintage paperbacks and they just look at it and they say, I don't know what to do with these, I think the first step is just to realize that it is worth taking a moment to look at them rather than donating them or throwing them away or recycling or whatever you choose to do. the vast majority of books, it's true, are not rare books. I mean, it's kind of what rare means, is that they are, scarce. And so every day I have emails of someone saying, oh, I have this 18th century book, and because it's old, it must be rare, right? But it's an 8th edition of a book of sermons with the binding broken. And I'm like, no one's going to buy that. So I can't sell it. Mm-hmm. Again, we're talking marketplace values here, not sentimental value. That book may have passed through that person's family for generations, and the sentimental value there is very different. No marketplace value, but maybe some sentimental value. And the same thing kind of goes for this, which is to say, start with the investigation. Just start with the idea that you should investigate it all. And there is, I think, a frustration here of not knowing what to do because the advice and the information you get online is very contradictory. You might throw in the title of the book that you have in your hands, and then you see, 200 different copies, and some are $5, some are $20, some are $200, some are $2,000, and you say, what's happening here? And so the main piece of advice I would give is that you just want to make sure when you're looking online or you're looking at online bookseller marketplaces, for example, that you're comparing apples and apples, which is to say, if the listing that you're looking for doesn't actually match yours in the particulars, it has a different publisher, a different date of publication, a different binding, it is or is not signed, the condition is radically different than yours. All of those things are comparing apples and oranges. And so that is not actually going to be a market comparable for you in figuring out whether there is any marketplace value to your books. So that's really the first step, is just making sure that you are paying attention to the particulars. It is not just the title. It is not just the author. It's all of those little details about what makes this book a historical artifact, all of the physical particulars of that object. And so that is the first thing. The next step, I would say, though, is that experts do exist. You can call people. As I say, I do, in fact, buy books from people emailing or calling me. We have a whole system, like on our website, we have a Sell to Us page, and that says, this is the information we need in order to consider your books for sale. And the reason we have that page set up that way is because we answer that question so much for people that it's easier just to have it on the website rather than explain every single time, right? So that's the other thing, is there are many dealers across the United States who are looking for material, who are hunting for it every day. And so what I would recommend is going to a website like abaa.org. ABAA.org is the website of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, which is the nation's leading trade organization for my profession, for antiquarian book dealers. And when you go to that website, you can click on a tab at the top that says Booksellers, and that actually allows you to search for booksellers by geographic location. So wherever you are in the United States, you can call or you can email based on who you are seeing in the list of book dealers near you. And a lot of book dealers, too, will tell you things like, oh, well, this is out of my scope, but you may want to try this person. Or another person might say, like, look, I don't think these are saleable. But the idea is that you have done your due diligence. So those are kind of the two steps that I would recommend, is paying attention to the particulars when you're looking online and compare apples to apples, and actually get in contact with professionals.
Nice, great. And you have a lot of information on your company website and on your personal website, RebeccaRomney.com, about getting started and terms of the trade and things like that, which are really helpful.
And we will link to those in the show notes so everyone can find them.
Yeah. So, Rebecca, do you have any, if we can be nosy, do you have any other book projects or writing projects in the works right now that you're willing to talk about?
I do, because I am actually sitting right next to the draft I'm about to turn in for my new book that's coming out in a year with Simon & Schuster. And it is related to what we're talking about, unsurprisingly. It's called Jane Austen's Bookshelf. And it is the story of my quest to create a book collection of Jane Austen's favorite women writers. And so It is about these women writers and me learning about them, but it's also very much about my experience building a book collection. I started it because in my job as a rare book dealer, I do a lot of work about the history of the novel. I'm looking at people's significance, and I had come across Frances Burney, who is an author who Jane Austen mentions as a great author in her book Northanger Abbey. She actually cites two of Burney's novels in there. And I had not realized that. I didn't realize that she was the big writer of courtship novels before Austen. So I had thought, oh, maybe I should look into her. And as soon as I did, I saw that the phrase Pride and Prejudice actually was probably taken by Austen from Frances Burney's second book.
Wow.
So I know, that was my reaction. I said, wait, what? Let's slow down here. Let's rewind. And so then I started saying, okay, I've missed something here. I thought I knew Austen's favorite writers. I thought I had read a lot of them. And then I went through and I was like, okay, so she likes Samuel Richardson. She likes John Milton. She likes Samuel Johnson. I read all of them. She also likes Frances Burney and Maria Edgeworth and Anne Radcliffe. I hadn't read any of them. And I thought it really interesting that I had completely accidentally, sort of unconsciously, read all of the male writers that she liked, but I hadn't read any of the women writers that she liked. And I thought I should probably correct for that. And so that was the beginning of this journey, this investigation to say, okay, let's look at these writers. Why didn't I know about them? And in collecting books about them, what do I learn about their legacies and why we don't really know them the way we know Austen today?
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. That
wow.
Sounds really fantastic. Yes. And we hope that you'll come back on when that book is published.
I would love to, because I have very strong feelings about these authors now. I spent years reading their books and reading about them, and now I love them. And so any chance to praise them, I would love to do that.
Very cool. Great. So out of that group that you just told us about, is there like one novel that you would recommend that everyone should get out and read?
Ooh, that's hard. Yeah, it really, really depends on your taste. I think if you are interested in books that are like Jane Austen, Frances Burney's Evelina is a good example. A book I loved, though, is Elizabeth Inchbald's Simple Story, which was actually, I had a copy of that in the romance collection. The first half of it, it's sort of broken into two halves, and the first half of it is perfect. It's a perfect book. And it's funny, and it's interesting. When I was reading it, this is when Twitter was still Twitter. When I was reading it, I wanted to tweet lines from it. It was so good.
Oh, wow.
But then if you're just thinking more widely, there's a book that I am just astounded we don't talk about it anymore. It's called Harrington by Maria Edgeworth. And it was stimulated because Edgeworth had created some characters in her earlier novels who were clearly anti-Semitic caricatures. And she had a letter from a fan, an American Jewish woman, who said, "Hey, why are you doing that? That seems silly. I don't think that is very thoughtful of you." And Maria Edgeworth, instead of being like, ugh, whatever, haters, instead she said, yeah, why did I do that? Why did I just automatically do that? And she wrote Harrington about a guy who kind of has this similar experience where he grows up just sort of imbibing casual anti-Semitism. And then he falls in love with a Jewish woman. And he has to sort of reckon with all of this and reckon with the cultures that he's getting from his Anglican Protestant family versus his love and belief in the value in this woman who's Jewish. It is a fascinating and beautiful and riveting novel that I think people would really find still important and sort of relatable today. I think it speaks to a lot of the things that we talk about these days, and it's just really well written. So
all right.
I think people should read it.
Okay, cool. I'm on it.
Well, we're looking for our third quarter read along for this year. Maybe that'll be it. I wonder if it's readily available. I mean, that's probably one of the problems with some of the books that you talk about in your new book, right?
That used to be the case, but pretty much all of them, if you can stomach it, you can read them online. They're available for free online because they're in public domain. Mm-hmm. And if you don't want to read on screens, you know, the vast majority of these have had many, many reprints over centuries. And so I have copies that I bought as $5 paperbacks, the 1980s reprint. So they're actually very, very accessible on the secondhand marketplace as reprints, and they are very accessible online for free.
Oh, right on.
Very cool. Yeah, fantastic.
This is just kind of a curiosity to me that now with contemporary books, I'm sure it has a name that you two know that I don't know. A lot of authors sign a million gazillion sheets of paper that then they put in the front of the book, versus when you go to a book event and you get the book signed by the author. Does that have a huge impact on the values for seeing down 50 years from now? I know you're not a fortune teller, but I'm curious what you think of that practice.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about how it has played out in the marketplace thus far, because this practice has existed for quite a while. It's just sort of exploded lately. There are editions of books where they'll say there'll be limited editions that are issued by publishers. And they will do this exact thing. Well, they'll have the author sign a bunch of individual leaves. And then when the book is bound by the publisher, that will be bound in, right? So that's what you're talking about. This practice has existed for decades. And so when I see a copy of this, then I will describe it accordingly. It'll be a signed limited edition, one of 500 copies with a specially signed leaf bound in. So there are specific ways that we describe it. And one of the things that's beneficial to that is that you don't have to worry about forgeries in that case. Because in order to forge that signature, you have to forge the entire book. You have to forge the binding. It's not just, a single sheet of paper or, whatever. And so when you look at something like that, it sort of is automatically authenticated. And if you're going online and you're looking at all of these signed books and you're thinking, some of these signatures don't look right, and you feel a little uncomfortable, a signed limited edition like that is very highly desirable because you don't have to worry about that. On the other hand, it doesn't have the same romance as that feeling of this author touched this book. This was once in the author's hand. We know that the sheet was in the author's hand, but the author probably did not touch that book. And you don't have the memories associated with it as you do when you take a book to an author signing and get it signed that way. And so you kind of have two sort of competing values there on those two. And for that reason, it actually kind of evens out. That I have not yet seen as a whole examples of that really hurting the marketplace value of the book. The time that it does is when the leaf that they have signed, that tipped in leaf, was tipped in later, which is to say it was not bound by the publisher. Someone else got the author to sign something and then they bound it in. In that case, you don't have the automatic authentication of this came from the publisher. I know it's right. Anyone could have added that in.
Right.
Okay.
And so there is actually a very big difference on the marketplace between books that are signed on what we call a tipped in leaf, which is to say added later, versus books that were bound with that leaf in from the beginning.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a very small distinction.
Yeah.
That's what kind of you get into when you start
Totally.
collecting, is you dig into all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
interesting.
I do have one more question. And this is a completely subjective kind of question after that more technical one. But what is the weirdest thing you've ever sold as a rare book dealer?
Well, I don't know if I can say number one, but I can tell you something really weird that I sold recently that I still feel weird about. At the New York Book Fair this year, it's a big rare book fair in New York City. It's considered the finest book fair in the world. It's a huge event, definitely our biggest event of the year. We brought a collection of material related to Sylvia Plath because we had bought a library from someone who had been friends with Sylvia Plath's mother, Aurelia Plath. And as a result, we had not only first editions of the Bell Jar and Ariel, things like that, but we also had a number of unique items from Sylvia Plath's childhood. One of them was this amazing, stunning painting that she did that I just love, and it would hang on my wall even if it weren't Plath. It's so good. But one of the items that came with all of this was a lock of Sylvia Plath's hair that her mother Aurelia had kept from when she was a child. And it was in an envelope, and it was marked in Aurelia Plath's handwriting, Sylvia Plath's hair, at age, with the date. All of it was like very carefully kept and preserved. And I was like, okay, it's one thing to sell someone's signatures, someone's books, but this was like part of Sylvia Plath's body.
Yeah, there's
Right.
DNA.
And yes.
Yeah.
And so I really struggled with that, but it was also, it was part of this collection that came directly from her mother. And I was sort of struggling about how to handle it because it was part of this cohesive sort of exhibition that we created, and how do we bring it out? If we don't sell it along with this, what do we do with it? And we ended up selling it at the fair to a woman who was a Sylvia Plath super fan. And I actually feel great about that. I wouldn't want to sell it to anyone, but the way that she was responding to it was very meaningful. That kind of gets to something that's very weird, and I totally get it if people are listening to this and thinking, ew, gross, I don't like that at all. I get it. I really do. But it was comforting to me to see that it did end up in a home where someone would appreciate it and not be weird about it. Mm-hmm. And that is a lot of what you're doing as a dealer, is you are just this short-term caretaker to shepherd these things through to longer-term caretakers. And so that's constantly when people say, oh, like, how do you let these things go? They're so amazing that you have. Well, I do it because I'm comforted by the fact that I know that it's going to a good place, that it's going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. Well, I love that you've described yourself as a caretaker and enabler. That's it. I probably couldn't remember it because I have tendencies. But yeah, that's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I, as you see, have very strong feelings about some of these things. So it is nice to be given the space to have a conversation with people who are genuinely curious. And I hope that it sparks some curiosity for the listeners too.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.